joy. Alleluia, Christ is risen. But what is this thing of resurrection that we proclaim? How are we to understand it? Just what is it we are affirming and declaring when we say we believe in resurrection? Those aren't easy questions to answer. They're not for us today in the 21st century, nor have they ever been for the church. When I taught theology to seminarians, I would describe the array of theological thinking and beliefs about the resurrection that exist in the Christian tradition, ranging from it being a historical fact to resurrection being what happened within the disciples. I would begin and conclude with, we know that something happened, but there's no singular way to understand the resurrection. One year, the students made me this tile, which I know you can't really see, but it says, "Something happened," with a butterfly beneath, a symbol of resurrection. Now, the Christian calendar seems to follow the idea that resurrection is not easy to comprehend. It sets the season of Easter as 50 days, from Easter Sunday to Pentecost, 7 Sundays of Easter. That calendar gives us time to ponder and time to take in what happened. It suggests that we should dwell on this mystery in our minds and hearts, that we should give ourselves time to probe its meaning and significance. In the Episcopal Church's 3-year lectionary, the gospel portion that I just read from John is always the designated gospel reading for the second Sunday of Easter, which suggests that the church deems it an important text that has to be heard over and over. The story of Christ's appearance to the disciples and the story of Thomas, who has ever since been known in the tradition as Doubting Thomas. That story tells us that even the disciples had trouble knowing what to do with the experience of resurrection. The passage from John indicates that on that first Easter evening, the disciples were gathered behind locked doors because they were afraid. Now let's think for a minute about what this means. They were hiding out of fear. They weren't out on the streets proclaiming Christ is risen, as we hear in Acts over and over again. They were behind locked doors, afraid. Afraid of what? That they might be the next to be arrested and crucified? Afraid that they could not, because they could not believe their Savior was crucified? Afraid because they didn't know what to do next? Afraid because they were traumatized by all they had experienced. In the midst of their fear came Jesus. Jesus stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he showed them his wounds, his hands, and his side. And with that, the disciples recognized him. They knew him to be the one who had been crucified, and they knew that somehow that crucifixion had not defeated him. They knew they had seen Christ. Thomas, however, as we heard, wasn't there when this happened. He didn't see, and he wouldn't take the word of the others for it. He wanted proof. He wanted to see for himself. Unless I see in Jesus' hands the print of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand in Jesus' side, I will not believe. So again, the next week, 8 days later, corresponding to this Sunday, the one after the first day of Christ's resurrection, Jesus returned. Now, take note that the disciples were again in the room. The doors were shut. Presumably, they're still afraid. Their initial encounter with the risen Christ had not worked to move them out of that fear and out of that room. So Jesus returned and addressed Thomas. Jesus bid Thomas to see and touch the wounds, to have his evidence, his proof, that the one who stood before him was the one who was crucified. And Thomas doesn't do that. He doesn't do what he said he needed. At that moment, Thomas believed and declared, "My sovereign and my God." And Jesus responded, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." Such sentiments, are echoed in the passage from 1 Peter, which speaks of the genuineness of faith in Jesus Christ for those generations who have not encountered Christ directly. Although you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy. For you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Thomas seemed to want proof. He wanted to see for himself. Even this follower of Jesus, who had been with him in his ministry and on his journeys, who had eaten with him at the Last Supper and seen Jesus taken away and crucified, he still wanted proof. As I've said, the resurrection is not easy to comprehend, to believe, to accept, to live. It wasn't then, and it isn't now. So what is this thing of resurrection? The early church affirmed again and again that the resurrection was a victory. The church asserted that in the resurrection, God defeated the forces of evil and death, that God overcame the things that destroy life so that they no longer have absolute dominion. The resurrection meant the triumph of life, not in a vague and general way, but the specific and concrete triumph of life and goodness in the face of real, concrete, and brutal evil and death. The kind of evil that puts nails into flesh and creates wounds that the triumph of resurrection may transform but not erase. That resurrection meant the uncompromising yes of life in the face of the screaming no's of evil. For those early Christians, the resurrection was God's victory in a cosmic battle, a struggle between the forces of good and evil played out on the battlefield of Jesus' person, the results of which benefited all those who were in God's camp. They would know life and experience goodness as stronger than evil because God had won the decisive victory. That was the reality of resurrection faith for them. But how about us? What is this thing of resurrection, and how are we to understand it? I, for one, see and witness resurrection when life and goodness continue to triumph over evil and death in our lives, in our concrete and specific lives, in the everyday mundaneness and in their glorious majesty. That triumph is not so much about cosmic battles, and it's not about dramatic appearances, but it is miraculous and mysterious. It's not about fact and empirical proof, not about seeing and touching, but it is real and manifest all around us for those who have faith in the power of the God of goodness and life, faith in the reality of hope that springs forth ever anew to transform the most oppressive of situations, the most wounded of lives. And that means we need to look for signs of resurrection, not signs as concrete as Thomas's insistence that he put his fingers in the wounds, but signs that feed our souls and sustain our lives, signs of the presence of goodness, of the promise of new life, signs of spring, if you will, those signs that we so yearn for, maybe even more this year after such a long, cold, snowy, difficult winter. Those first daffodils or the golden forsythia are signs that the longest winter of snow and cold is not endless. It is not forever. That new life and color and radiant sunshine will return. But resurrection is not simply like the seasons whose cycles we can count on and track. Resurrection life, the power of life to prevail and of goodness to manifest itself, is always threatened and always possible, in every moment, in any circumstance. If we don't look, if we're not attuned, we won't notice. If we but look with faith, we can perceive it. Resurrection is when hope and goodness and life prevail. It is made manifest through grace in our lives, a quality of giftedness and transformation which has the power to change so-called reality. Resurrection is when a friend and I come up against a wall in our relationship and manage to turn it into a bridge. Resurrection is when you are sorely afraid to do something and you risk it anyway and find that you can do it. It's when people keep protesting injustice, even when they are told that 90% of the populace doesn't agree with them. It is when all we have is a loaf of bread, and yet we share it. Whether in small gestures in our lives or in grand-scale movements of change, resurrection is about grace and life and goodness and hope. In the face of all the evidence there is of evil and of death, especially in these days when so much in our society and world seem to be crumbling, when we find more and more ways in which we wound one another, often through the most intimate of relationships, and when the lines for food and shelter grow daily, there can be no doubt that evil exists and the forces of destruction are strong. They even seem to be thriving. Precisely in the face of such potential for despair, we must be believers in resurrection, who are attuned to the signs and dare to declare the reality and power of life. Alleluia, Christ is risen. What is this thing of resurrection? To affirm that Christ is risen is to believe in life, to be open to grace, and to be full of hope. Believing in the resurrection means to live abundantly, no matter what our material circumstances. It is to proclaim with joy, Alleluia, Christ is risen. May it be so.